Now, today, I want to look at what has been, until recently, a very neglected area of study: the scratched, scribbled and burnt marks that people have left on churches over the years. While sometimes they may seem to detract from the building, they do provide a fascinating record of people of times past and how they interacted with church buildings. This pillar that you can hardly see for the scratch marks is in Bramford in Suffolk. To quote Matthew Champion, a leading researcher in this field, the chances are that if you read a newspaper story or magazine article that includes the words church and graffiti in the same sentence, then the ending is unlikely to be a happy one. This slightly despairing sign, happily surrounded by countless graffiti, is in Canterbury Cathedral. Nobody takes a blind bit of notice of it and probably never have. Today, we tend to regard graffiti as a form of vandalism. Now imagine walking into your local church, pulling a penknife from your pocket and scratching a drawing into the wall. A geometric design, a drawing of a boat, even a few meaningful words. Today, that would be sacrilege, but many churches are covered in riots of graffiti, both medieval and modern, scratched into what were once boldly coloured walls. Indeed, at least in the Middle Ages, the practice appears to have been condoned and sometimes even encouraged by church authorities. The surviving scrawls provide a tantalising glimpse of how the users of church buildings have viewed religion and interacted with their churches. So when does vandalism become a matter of art and social record? Matthew Champion is one of the leading contemporary scholars in this field. Here he is engaged in recording graffiti in Norfolk. His description of this work is endearing. Searching for medieval graffiti inscriptions in East Anglian churches is never quite as boring as we like to make it sound sometimes. Yes, there is a great deal of staring at the walls, shining lights across the surface, and trying to interpret the many thousands of markings we find there. A lot of the time it's frustrating, when the wall surface may be completely blank, or so covered in markings that it's impossible to unravel the numerous entangled inscriptions that crowd the surface. Apart from the frustration, it's most certainly cold. There's nothing quite like sitting in a freezing stone church for hours on end to truly understand the meaning of cold and the advantages of thermal underwear. If you tend to work alone, as I usually do, it can also be lonely. You spend many hours muttering to yourself, holding entire conversations, or even writing aloud sections of new articles. Sometimes swearing is involved. Is it any wonder when a church warden enters a church for the third time that day to discover the same muttering individuals staring at the walls, that on occasion they thought they were dealing with a madman? Perhaps they are. A madman who points at walls. While Matthew's research deals mainly with medieval graffiti on stone walls, graffiti may be executed on stone, wood, plaster or lead surfaces and range in date from the early medieval to modern. The term means scratched, and it can be limited to that, but I'm choosing to look also at other ways of marking, such as paint, ink and pencil as well. So, where do we look for graffiti? Well, the simple answer is everywhere, but some locations lend themselves better than others. Before you enter the building, you may well find graffiti. This curious individual is scratched on the outside wall of the church at North Cerney, and is a beast called a manticore. Manticores are meant to have the body of a lion and the head and shoulders of a man, though this one has feet that look like hooves and a tail that bears a passing resemblance to that of a beaver. Monsters are often depicted on the outsides of medieval churches, but they usually appear as corbels, not as engravings. This one takes up more than a linear metre of wall. The best guess is this is a mason's graffito carved in the 16th century. On south-facing walls, especially near the priest's door, you'll often find scratch tiles, like these on the buttress by the south door of St Michael and All Angels, Waddenhoe in Northamptonshire. The photograph taken about 4:30 at St John Evangelist Caldecott in Rutland shows how they worked. And for once, this one appears to be pretty nearly accurate. It's also worth looking at the churchyard wall. This triskele of fishes is on the churchyard wall in Old Malton. Whether it was cut after the 19th century wall was built, or whether it's a reused piece, I have absolutely no idea, but the church has taken it as a sort of emblem for use in other places in the church. Church doorways and porches are a great place for graffiti. Often there are masses of small crosses cut into the stonework. While they used to be thought the work of pilgrims, either setting out or arriving, and this may be true of some, especially the great pilgrimage sites, it's now thought they may well commemorate the sealing of contracts that often took place in church porches. So you made your X on the paper and you then carved a cross on the door. This example is at Hales in Norfolk. Also found in church porches are hand marks, a line scratched around a person's hand. Again, these may well relate to the sealing of contracts, quite possibly betrothals or marriages. This example is in the portrait Little Comberton in Worcestershire. I hope you can see them. Most often found around porches are the curious vertical marks, often referred to as arrow sharpening grooves, like these at Thirsk. This has largely been now abandoned as a theory. After all, when everyone had a whetstone, why would you? More likely, though equally unproven, is the results of people carefully scraping stone dust from the walls of a holy place to use in folk medicine. Hildegard of Bingen recommends a plaster made from this as a remedy for infected wounds. Inside the church, all sorts of graffiti can be found on almost any surface. Two types are found in concentrations within the church, often on pillars. At the west end of the church, surrounding the font, small geometrical circles and figures made with compass-drawn circles are particularly common. It's been suggested these constitute charms or prayers for protection for the vulnerable newly baptized. This example is at Old Malton, on stonework that would have been the westernmost pillar of the south arcade. The other type of especially medieval graffiti that seem to be concentrated in particular areas are ships. These are often found towards the east end of a side aisle, and it's been suggested these may indicate where an altar was dedicated to St. Nicholas, patron of ships and sailors. At Blakeney, despite the whole church being covered by early inscriptions, all the ship graffiti appear on the south arcade, clustered around a side altar and an empty image niche. Each respects the other images round it, not covering them over, and archaeologists suggest they were created over a period of at least 2 centuries. The suggestion, therefore, is that many of these ship images were in fact devotional in nature, literally prayers made solid in stone. Exactly what the prayers were for remains something of a mystery, whether they thanks for a voyage safely undertaken, a prayer for a safe voyage yet to come, or perhaps a plea for a ship long overdue. We'll probably never know. However, it is possible there may be informal versions of votive ships, models which were displayed within churches at that time. Ringing chambers are often a fine location for graffiti. People with time on their hands and unsupervised by the clergy have enjoyed making their marks. Here at St. Mary's, Bishop's Canning, William Lye, or W. Lye at least, the sexton, left his record in 1910, down in the left corner. The ringing chamber at Old Malton is a sheer mass of graffiti on the walls, the wooden doors that open onto a sheer drop, and even the windows. Some, like the elegant 17th century TF, were probably done by visitors, but the majority are records of repairs, church events, and bell ringers. Rhys Diggins is the teenage son of the current vicar, and his autograph presumably records his first time being strong-armed into ringing the bells for a wedding. Choristers are much given to graffiti to while away tedious sermons, and the choir stalls in Pembroke College, Cambridge, carry a fine selection of the names of musically inclined undergraduates. As this was a seat I frequently sat in when I was a choir member here, I was greatly tempted to make my mark, alongside my great-grandfather, Joseph Boasted Wilson, who carved his name in 1863. You can see it's central and at the top of that selection. Musical notation is one of the very rarest of all types of early church graffiti, with only a few dozen high-quality examples being recorded across the entire country. In most cases, these inscriptions are to be found in our larger religious buildings, such as Norwich Cathedral and York Minster. And most examples identified to date appear to be examples of chant or plain song. This example is from the passage from the chapter house to the choir of York Minster. It suggests this was a point where musically trained individuals were hanging around with time on their hands. Similar, but more recent evidence of bored choristers can be found in the song school at Southwark Cathedral. Adam Leigh Bounden. Less common are graffiti on the organ. At Elmdon in Essex, a largely Victorian rebuild of a medieval church, the back of the organ is covered with scratched and penciled graffiti, as well as a "what no air" and the penciled rotors of organ blowers on the right there are presumably semi-official. The organ at Bardfield Salling bears the brusque instruction to the young organ blower, "Do not sing." The pillars at Ashwell show a running commentary, mainly medieval, on life in the parish. As many joys of the font as there are sorrows of Calvary's cross. Pride goes before a fall. Barbara is a little vixen. Drunkenness breaks whatever wisdom touches. The corners are not joined correctly, I spit on them. The Archdeacon is an ass. And rather more recently, God not guns. Box pews are another nice secluded spot for artistic endeavour. This graffito in the box pew at St Augustine, Brooklands, at least demonstrates that 19th century girls as well as boys came to church armed with penknives. It's not a unique one. There are several box pews with that sort of inscription on them. Where galleries survive, the pews are also full of graffiti. Again, sitting in the back row of the gallery, people were relatively unsupervised and could relieve the boredom of long sermons. This little selection is in the North Gallery at St Mary's, Whitby. Whoops. Oh, heavens. And of course, there's one environment that's absolutely irresistible to any perpetrator of graffiti: alabaster tombs. This is in East Yorkshire on the 13th century church of St Nicholas Hornsey. Here, the chest tomb of Antonis and Quintin, who died in 1430, is densely ornamented with shoe outlines. So, what were they for? Well, we start with prayers and magic. A large proportion of the graffiti, especially the medieval ones, are simple and seem to be connected with protection of church and people from the powers of darkness. At St Mary's Caldecott, there are traces of the medieval people who left the marks of their faith and devotion scratched into the stonework. At the base of the tower can be seen an elaborate knotwork design, sometimes referred to as a pelter or Solomon's knot. This symbol isn't very common among medieval church graffiti, but it's found elsewhere in church architecture and decoration. In England, its use stretches back to the 12th century, when it was seen as an alternative to the normal cross or crucifix. The walls of the 15th century porch are covered with a mass of markings, initials, dates, crosses, compass-drawn designs are all these signs of devotion and protection. And even the font is honeycombed with holes and lines. It would appear that while we today regard graffiti as a form of antisocial behaviour, this wasn't the case in the Middle Ages. Many of these markings were actually devotional and religious in nature, prayers made solid in stone. They seem to have been the equivalent of a rosary, an aid to keeping count of repeated prayers, perhaps those given as a penance, 28 Aves or 12 Paternosters or whatever. So you'd move from hole to hole. At St Dunstan, Snargate, Kent, are a number of compass-drawn daisy wheels and crosses. These marks could be devotional. The daisy was the flower of Mary and the infant Christ. However, in most contexts, they're often believed to be apotropaic, that's protective. One theory is that the protective marks worked on the premise that evil entities were less than bright and would follow a line to an end. So some believe that the endless lines were intended to trap them for eternity. Many of these compass-drawn designs are focused around the font and porch and are very small, like this example from St Andrew's Church in Hellions Bumpstead in Essex. There is the question of who made them and how. After all, compasses were expensive pieces of specialist equipment and certainly not something you would normally take to church. Matthew Champion speculates they could have been made using the little shears that women tended to carry around with them. These would be about the right size, so it's possible that these symbols were predominantly made by women wanting to protect their families and friends. This is a really spectacular compass-drawn daisy wheel in St Albans Cathedral. This probably was using compasses rather than just your scissors. These apotropaic compass-drawn figures are not limited to the Middle Ages. Here they are on the stairs to the porch upper chamber in St Nicholas at Wade, and this timber is almost certainly no earlier than the 18th century, but people are still making these marks. Sometimes people drew what they were afraid of. The flesh-wielding devil comes from Beechamwell in Norfolk, while this superb dragon-like creature is carved on Troston Church, also in Norfolk. Hidden away on the inside of the tower at Skipwith is this small panel showing a wolf-like creature and two warriors with a number of unarmed people fleeing from them. The scene seems to be Ragnarok, the last day's battle of Viking myth. It's a startling piece of work and an extraordinary evocation of panic and terror, and one of our earliest graffiti. Sometimes devotional graffiti are purely representative. This example on the lead lining of the font of St. Margaret's Hardley in Norfolk simply shows the Holy Sacrament. A good example of purely devotional graffiti is this rather fine Christogram at St. Mary's Ashwell. The conjoined W, sometimes referred to as a witch mark, is probably the best known of these symbols. It's been interpreted as standing for Virgo Virginum, Virgin of Virgins, an invocation to the Virgin Mary, so may have a devotional as well as protective meaning. These examples are on the choir stalls at All Saints, Maidstone. As its use was as a symbol rather than readable letters, it doesn't always appear right way up. This sidelong example is in Skelton Church. Some elaborate devotional graffiti must have taken a long time, such as these ones to be seen among the remains of the chapel at Norwich Castle. Here we see the Virgin and Child, St. Catherine and St. Christopher. More recent devotional graffiti include this really rather lovely large pencil sketch of Christ the Good Shepherd in St. John's, Duxford, which was apparently executed by a fire watcher on duty during World War II. Occasionally, graffiti reflect more formal worship, as at Parham in Suffolk, where a handsome medieval organ is shown, and even more rarely musical notation, as in the aisle of Norwich Cathedral and in Horning Church in Norfolk. Now, while I was hunting graffiti, I came across this extraordinary seat in Bishop's Canning Church. The seat is 18th century, but the painting it enshrines dates from the 15th century. It shows a hand of meditation, a guide to self-examination before making one's confession. From our point of view, it does seem to have gathered a fine array of graffiti. Initials and names span from the 16th to the 20th centuries, and there are also stars and circles, both thought to be apotropaic symbols, and crossed through sets of lines, suggesting that some were checking off their sins against a list. It seems likely this was originally a pew set aside for those awaiting their turn to make confession, or possibly hung by the seat of confession itself. But it does suggest that people sat there, gathered their thoughts together, and counted their sins before making their confessions. On the inside of the north door of Blytheborough Church in Suffolk are some curious scorch marks. You can see them on the right-hand door. These are common to medieval buildings and were long thought to be taper burns resulting from careless use of candles too near the vertical surface. However, recent research has shown that they're quite difficult to achieve and are almost certainly deliberate. They also seem to be found dating back to at least the 13th century and seem to have been added to the green timber during the construction of the building. In the medieval mind, candles, especially those that were associated with Candlemas, Easter and funerals, were seen as very powerful against the powers of evil. These dark powers were also associated with fires and lightning strike, both of which had catastrophic effects on buildings. A piece of wood from a lightning-struck oak tree was seen as a powerful charm against lightning, which never strikes twice in the same place. What could be more rational to combine these elements by using the candles on the doors, roof timbers, and rood screens of churches to drive out witches and demons, and to fake lightning-struck timber to protect the building? A good number of graffiti are made to commemorate people or events connected with the parish. Some are quite straightforwardly memorials to people whose families couldn't afford a tombstone but wanted some permanent record of their life and death. Graffiti in St. Mary's Ashwell tell us the story of the Black Death there. The smaller inscription on the church tower, we see, the first plague was in 1350-1, that is to say 1349. The larger inscription says, there was a plague, 1000, 3 times 300, 3 times 100, 10 times 5. 1350. Pitiable, fierce, violent. A wretched populace survives to witness the end. This year, a south wind, Maurus, thunders in the world. 1361. In All Saints and St Andrew's Church in Kingston, near Cambridge, graffiti record a family tragedy. Near the front door is a list of names dated 1515, a year when an epidemic of plague was rife in East Anglia. Among those named are Catherine, Jane, and Amy Madingley. Presumably these were sisters, probably children, as their names do not feature in any parish documents, though the family does. And almost certainly the list is a memorial to those of the village who died. So this is the only record of 3 little girls from one family struck down by the plague. Initials, names, dates, and memorials are perhaps the commonest types of graffiti found on pews and stalls. Kilroy was here graffiti can be hard to distinguish from memorials. Both often have a date, which in memorials may indicate the date of death, and in the other case is just the date of the visit. A house shape, usually with a date in the roof and initials in the body of the building, is usually believed to be a memorial, especially if there are flags or crosses on the roof. Where 2 dates are used, these are probably the lifespan of that person. This 17th century memorial is on the choir stalls of All Saints, Maidstone. And here on the base of the tower at Caldecott is a neatly cut inscription reading simply John Sanders, 1736, in a house-shaped carved frame. This type of inscription begins to appear about the same time as the elaborate wall memorials for the dead. And it's believed that many were created to act as informal memorials for the dead who couldn't afford the fine marble and alabaster, or perhaps even a gravestone. Other graffiti record important events in people's lives. We should probably never know who FB and BS were, who recorded their love in 1953 on the tower of Filey Old Church. But I can witness that the couple who recorded their marriage on the leads of the tower of Old Malton are my second daughter and her husband, Mags and Reg. Here we have, in St Mary Lidgate, a rebus or puzzle picture that seems to record the end of a relationship, possibly by death. It is a little complicated. So you can see to the left, you've got the word well, followed by the musical notes, fa, re, mi, la, followed by the letters D, D-I. Next comes the dice, which in medieval times was known as a cater, followed by Y-N-E. So the whole message reads, well fare, my Lady Catherine. Maybe she was going on a journey, but I suspect that she'd either died or left him. Now, this is slightly different. In Croik Church, in the north of Scotland. It's a church built in 1825 or thereabouts. And the Times, in an article on June 2nd, 1845, about the Highland clearances, reported that some 80 people who'd been cleared from Glencalvy to the south of Croik had found refuge in a common shelter made from poles and tarpaulins in Croik churchyard. No one knows what became of the 80 refugees living in the churchyard in May 1845, but the east window of Croik Church carries a number of graffiti. These include, Glencow people was in the churchyard here, May 24th, 1845. That's the one shown here. The Glencalvy tenants resided here, May the 24th, 1845. And perhaps most poignantly, Glencalvy people, the wicked generation Glencalvy. These are unlikely to have been written by the refugees themselves because they're recorded as only speaking Gaelic. Probably they were made by a witness of the events, possibly even the Times correspondent. So we move to ladies, gentlemen, and others. In St Giles Imber is this very lightly incised but detailed portrait of a high status gentleman dating from the early 15th century. Now here you can see it outlined. Look at his fashionably elaborate chaperone hat with a lily pipe and his long poulain shoes. He's very elegant. Also at St Giles Imber, the tower wall reveals a hornblower in a fancy hat and a male coif, together with a couple of hounds. While individual portraits and faces are commonly recorded by the surveys, it's unusual to be able to identify anything else about the individual. In this example, however, from Skull Church in Norfolk, the portrait is depicted wearing what looks to be a medieval mitre, and so is presumably a rather jolly bishop. At Marsham in Norfolk is this delightfully cartoonish rendering of St. George and the Dragon. Looking at the mason's mark on the next door stone, I suspect this might be an adaptation of existing graffiti of heraldry, forming the dragon, and a similar mason's mark, forming George's sword. But it does look to me as though George vanquished the dragon and then patted him on the head and said, "Good dog." This equally naive rendering of a knight wearing a conical helmet with a nasal is cut onto the lower chancel arch at Compton in Surrey. His armour suggests a date possibly as early as the 12th century. In the crypt at Canterbury Cathedral, there are no less than 5 different graffiti of mounted horsemen, including this example on the north side of the crypt. It looks unfinished in that the riders have no faces, but the detail in harness, saddle girth and reins is striking. The 2 riders on one horse suggest a possible Templar link, as this was their badge. But it may just represent a knight with a lady riding pillion. But the sheer size of that graffito is amazing. All Saints Parish Church, Leighton Buzzard, has this very deeply worked graffito of a theme more usual on misericords, the husband being beaten over the head by his spoon-wielding wife. Their clothing dates this one to about 1425. And somebody put a lot of work into it. This little 16th century graffito of a hunting scene is in the northern singing gallery of the Lady Chapel at Gloucester Cathedral, and it shows a man wearing mid-16th century attire, standing in a distinctive pose with his legs apart, by a hunting dog and a stag, with a church in the background. It's probably the work of a young chorister up in the gallery, who was there to sing during the service, but got bored. On the pillars to the north side of All Saints Sutton in Bedfordshire, there are a couple of distinctly strange individuals resembling nothing so much as Celtic warriors. Both have wild hair and chin beards, and one gives every impression of wearing a bird mask. This one also seems to be tattooed all over his chest and arms, though it could be an embroidered tunic. The other is elegantly clad in a figure-fitting stripy tunic. They clearly predate the Victorian whitewash, but who or what they represent is rather unclear. St Mary the Virgin, Barrow on the Hill, Leicestershire, has a rather splendid portrait of a World War I officer smoking a cheroot. And continuing the World War I theme, Kaiser Bill can be found lurking in Stony Middleton Church on a pew. Especially in the grander churches, some of the most obvious graffiti are those created by earlier visitors to the site. What stands out is just how many of these inscriptions date to the 18th and 19th centuries, and in many cases, just how neatly and precisely they've been carved. Until very recent times, the creation of graffiti on ancient buildings wasn't regarded as vandalism or something that was frowned upon. They were created by all levels of society, wishing to leave a mark of their visit, and many of our most notable ancient monuments are literally covered in them. It's also clear, where research has been undertaken, that the people who made these inscriptions were often of relatively high social status, being those who had time and leisure to make such visits. It's even said that early visitors to Egypt didn't even have to create their own inscriptions. They could hire a little man to do it for them. We may frown at the way these inscriptions deface churches, but it must be remembered they too are telling a story, the story of how these sites became tourist attractions. A frequent 16th century visitor to churches in the east of England was John Whaley. His elegant autograph can be found at St James's Church in Louth. 2 years later, the same chap was visiting Lincoln Cathedral, and here he is at Norwich Cathedral as well. We know nothing more about him, but he was clearly an avid collector of churches. Even the coronation chairs at Westminster Abbey are covered with graffiti dating between the 17th and 19th centuries, mainly, but not exclusively, by schoolboys at Westminster School. Visitors seem to have enjoyed leaving their mark on the windows of Cove Hythe Church in Suffolk. This particular vandal was Richard Henry Adams, a house painter who was born in 1850 in Marylebone and lived in Wimbledon in 1881. His wife Hannah was born in Cove Hythe, so presumably he was visiting the in-laws. Visitors left their names in the Church of St Bartholomew at Lower Sapie. It was pretty much deserted when this one was done. It is now in the care of the CCT, and you can inscribe your name in a visitor's book rather than on the walls.
As we did.
As we have done, at least twice. It's a lovely little church in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Aside from tourists, the most obvious group of people making their marks were the craftsmen working in or on the building. Chief among these were the masons. Great buildings like cathedrals were designed using rules of proportion, like the golden section. Mathematically, these numbers are difficult to comprehend, being based on the square root of whole numbers. However, using arcs and lines, the geometry is easy to construct. Once the overall design had been established, setting out would begin. Elements of the building would be inscribed full-size on great polished plaster floors, and then full-size templates would be made. In England, 2 of these floors survive, one at York Minster and the other in Wells Cathedral. Both are so placed in the building it's difficult to see them as being workshops, but rather the medieval equivalent of an architect's office. One thing that characterizes them both is they're high up in the building and have a good north light. A drawing of the York floor made in 1968 shows, among other drawings, a layout identified as the mid-14th century windows in the Lady Chapel. Photogrammetry work carried out on the Wells floor in 2016, picking out individual designs by enhancing initial scans, enabled the identification of designs for the vaulted ceiling of the East Cloister, here picked out in red. Masons' working drawings were not confined to floors. At Winchester Cathedral, the north wall of the north aisle of the retro chapel is covered with working drawings for the trefoil windows in the Lady Chapel. The reredos of the Lady Chapel in Gloucester Cathedral suffered badly during the Reformation. It once contained these large figures, where the modern painted panels are. They're large figures, where the modern painted panels are now, and surrounded by a number of much smaller figures. What the large figures were, we don't know, possibly Our Lady, St. Anne and St. Peter. But thanks to notes left on the stonework by the masons, we can identify almost all the smaller figures. So you can see we've got about 3 panels where we don't know what was there. This is the layout revealed. It's a curious mix ranging from really well-known saints, like John the Baptist and John the Evangelist, to vanishingly, devastatingly obscure, like Arilda and Harold of Gloucester, both of whom were child martyrs of Gloucester itself. In fact, the graffiti mean we probably know more about the saints represented than we would if statues had survived. A Snargate is an example of what may be a mason's working mark, where the stone was marked to ensure it was fitted the right angle to the building. These sort of marks should not be confused with the mason's banker marks, named for the stone bench on which they were produced. These allowed the craftsman to be identified for quality control and payment. Here you've got mason's banker marks from the Guild Chapel in Stratford-on-Avon. You can see the same mason making his mark on 2 different stones. Carpenters also carved working graffiti on the structure. These are joint assembly marks in the roof space of Malmesbury Abbey. Over the years, other workers left what amounted to advertising signs in corners of churches, such as this splendid pencil-drawn example in St. Nicholas Church in Dereham. Really is a beautiful bit of work. J. Hill, plumber, Hunmanby, on the 20th of August, 1947. He was of Hunmanby, and this is on Filey Tower roof, and it gives us a pretty good date for the completion of the lead repairs. Frequently, glaziers making repairs on church windows recorded their work by scratching their names and the date on a pane of glass. All these examples come from Otley in Suffolk. Quite apart from architectural designs, buildings also feature among graffiti on churches, like this one at St. Mary's Ashwell in Hertfordshire. It's difficult to be certain whether this is a castle sitting on a mound or a church with 2 towers. The windows would suggest the latter. Ashwell's a massive medieval graffiti, including what is thought to be one of Old St. Paul's in London. If that's right, it's an incredibly rare survival in any medium. Sorry, I'm having issues with it. Isn't the computer too hard? Post mills are common depictions on churches, ranging from the crude representation scratched on the fabric of King's College Chapel, Cambridge, to the really superb design at Dalham Church in Suffolk, probably dating to the 17th century. This beautiful decorated style window, sketched on a pillar in All Saints Leighton Buzzard in the 14th century, might give us a clue as to what its windows looked like before their perpendicular makeover. Really stunning. And a later example of buildings is this rather good 19th century illustration of Dover Castle, complete with the Union Jack, which is scratched on the walls of Canterbury Cathedral. So, of shoes and ships and sealing wax. I haven't found any sealing wax. We now turn to some less easily explained graffiti, some common, some just a bit odd. One rather strange but common form of graffito is the carving of shoes, usually but not exclusively on a horizontal surface. The shape of the shoes helps to date them, so we can see that here on the medieval font base from Morstan Church in North Norfolk, there are centuries worth of shoe outlines, presumably commemorating generations of visitors and parishioners. So we've got medieval, 17th century, 19th century, all there. Matt Champion suggests that shoe or foot graffiti may suggest pilgrimage, and at the big pilgrimage sites such as Canterbury Cathedral, there certainly are hundreds. However, they're also found in churches that are not obvious pilgrim destinations, and he suggests they're also simply concerned with travelling, either a prayer for a safe journey or thanksgiving for one safely achieved. There are very high fashion 15th century poulain type shoes at Selborne on the left. They don't really look to me very suitable for serious walking. At Troston in Suffolk, it's not clear whether the medieval shoe graffito has a link to the rather splendid demon overlapping it, but perhaps it represents treading the devil to the floor. St Mary Magdalene Caldecott in Hertfordshire is in the care of the Friends of Friendless Churches. If you look down as you enter the porch, you will see several outlines of post-medieval, probably 17th to 18th century, hobnailed shoes carved into the stone floor. Though several of the shoe outlines are now badly worn, it's still possible to make out pairs of initials carved into each, the initials of those who traced around their own shoe many centuries ago. This very handsome right shoe in wriggle work is engraved on the tower leads of Filey Old Church. MC put a lot of work into this in 1772. Even earlier is this rather elegant glove on the same roof dated to 1694. Despite the sea air, the roof has survived extremely well. Another very common group is ships. Not surprisingly, they're very common in coastal areas. The pews of St Mary's Whitby are full of them, especially in the gallery pews. And you can see a range of the different types there. The paddle steamer Emu is unusual as being actually identifiable. Built on the Tyne in 1871, Emu came to Whitby in 1873 and carried on regular ferry service to Scarborough in the 1880s, ignominiously running aground in full view of Scarborough Spa in 1888. At St Sampson's Cricklade, there are medieval ship graffiti in the tower, a fine ship graffito on the tower staircase, and a less well executed ship in the ringing chamber. This rather nice medieval ship on a pillar at St Mary's Parham is complete with crow's nest and anchor, together with two rather odd-looking crew members. 19th century ships on a box pew in St Augustine's Brooklands in Kent. While the three-master is civilian, the single-masted ship appears to be a sloop of the line with a row of gun ports. A small and rather childlike graffito on a box pew in All Saints Graveley shows a small steamer, though most of these sketches show sailing ships. These are probably the work of bored children rather than sailors. This handsome Whitby cat, a brig-rigged merchantman of the 18th and 19th centuries, is scratched into the leads of St Oswald's Church in Filey. Perhaps related to ship graffiti is this scratched impression of the signal station at Whitby, carved in 1664 on one of the pillars of St Mary's Church, Whitby. Other more recent transport graffiti include a horse and rider and a penny farthing from behind the organ at Elmdon in Essex, and a really splendid 1930s aeroplane at Campsie Ash in Suffolk. There's much discussion as to whether the graffiti resembling gaming boards are just that, or whether they're apotropaic signs to ward away evil. Probably both are true, but it's hard to tell which belong to which category. The three men's Morris boards, scratched into the stone seating at the south porch of the Church of St Wilfrid, Huntingdon in Lincolnshire, probably do represent a favourite game for bored parishioners or clergy waiting for wedding and funeral parties. However, the high windowsill of St Cosmas and St Damian in Sherrington seems an unlikely place to sit and play, and it's much more likely that there they're guarding a vulnerable place from evil. Somebody seems to have had fun creating this happy fish on the external wall of St John's Oxburgh in Norfolk. It may well be medieval, but it really could be any date at all. It's just rather fun. And finally, before I end, I must acknowledge the huge debt I owe to those who generously make the results of their researches available to us all on the internet, especially Matt Champion of the Norfolk and Suffolk Medieval Graffiti Project, whose book I cannot sufficiently recommend. It's readable, it's fascinating, and well worth reading. And also Anthea Horden of Raking Light, a website dedicated to this. And one last question. Are benchmarks graffiti? They were cut into the fabric of churches, often many centuries after the construction of the building, yet they're official and purposeful. I leave it with you. Are they or are they not? And that, as they say, is it.